about when you were talking about valuing human life. Was very much reminded of the willingness to pay versus the ability to pay, and how neoclassical economists kind of assumes standardly that it's the willingness to pay we're looking at.
Exactly.
And that comes back to what you said.
No, I mean, willingness to pay is a central concept in the cost-benefit analysis. So, I mean, I couldn't go into that. But yes, I mean, basically the point is that in market transactions, your demand basically has to be backed up by money. Unless you are willing to pay for something, you are not going to get it. So the willingness to pay for a market-based framework is crucial. The ability doesn't matter because then it's the demand is not real. A very good illustration of this problem is that until the Mr. Bill Gates and his foundation started to give more money into research on malaria drugs, the world was spending 20 times more money researching slimming drugs than malaria drugs. And these slimming drugs are mainly taken by people who are interested in aesthetics. It's not really about the kind of risk of dying and that kind of stuff. And malaria, and really very few people die from being, slightly overweight. In contrast, malaria kills at least 1 million people per year worldwide and debilitates many more hundreds of thousands. So, at one level, you say, are we crazy? Why are we spending 20 times more money on something that is essentially about lifestyle and feeling good compared to something that is literally killing millions of people? Well, the answer is simple, because it's market-driven. People who want to buy these slimming drugs have far more money than the people who are dying of malaria, because these tend to be poor people in Africa and Southeast Asia. Whereas the people who want to buy the slimming drugs are rich people in North America, Europe, and East Asia. As simple as that. So yes, I mean that this root in the market-based framework and the use of this notion of willingness to pay is really a very serious problem. Now, once again, I mean, I'm not saying that you should never use market prices. You should never use the willingness to pay. Sometimes you have to, but once again, you have to be very careful in then jumping to the conclusion that, yes, I have a scientific solution, and this is what we should do.
It's interesting because this particular part of the lecture really reminds me of ongoing discourse in this particular sector called impact investing, where investors trying to invest not only for monetary values, but social and environmental impact. And what's very difficult at the moment, and still people are trying to find the right solution, we're not quite there yet, is how to calculate impact. So when it comes down to one example of a particular asset is big issues. Homeless people sell magazines and there's profit, revenue, cost, etc. in terms of producing and selling magazines, whereas increasing their welfare and reinvesting those extra surplus profit into their education, reemployment, etc. How do we calculate those values? And I'm just thinking, I definitely understand where you're getting at in terms of we need to be more cautious about and careful about approaching to these more important values, and we can't just calculate these and turn them into number, which I totally agree on. But there's really quite significant. It just takes time to put together people, and even those people who share values, they quite often can't agree on, how do we think of this amount of impact. So I'm just wondering what you think about.
I mean, I think the only solution, I mean, not just for this, but other similar things, is to use a multiplicity of approach to cover these different aspects, and B, trying to come up with more kind of qualitative, nuanced evaluation than trying too much to reduce everything to a single number. That is a great attraction to having a single number that you can throw at everyone. For some things, this is the right approach. Yeah? But for things like climate change or impact investment, this is rather problematic. So in those areas, you need to, do some basic cost-benefit analysis, but also, try to ponder about, the value of people, say, having employment over, say, just getting a subsidy. The amount of money they get might be the same, but the implications for human welfare is quite different. Yeah? You need to be frank about the difficulties involved. You need to be upfront about the impossibility of putting monetary value on human life, while kind of recognizing that people have come up with these numbers for these reasons. Is there any information that you can usefully use from that exercise? I'm not talking about the final number because that's kind of problematic. Yeah? But in making these calculations, people have done certain things, and is there anything that you can learn from that? So I think that we need a much more kind of pluralistic and reflective approach to issues like this. If you are, trying to build a road or produce a new toothpaste, these will be relatively easy to deal with a single or at most a couple of approaches. But for something like this, the climate change or work and human welfare and so on, you need to be a lot more a lot broader and a lot more careful.
You've discussed the modeling that goes into scenarios, business as usual, etc. And when you were talking about the precautionary principle at the end, it also reminded me that there is a lot of theories that, or the research that suggests that the dynamic of how this problem develops is rather that of a tipping point, which we might have breached, and that's on one hand, and on the other, that many of the things, of the solutions that are being tried, or of the pollutions that we emit, might have consequences that we're not even aware of, and they might create statistical black swans and alter those business as usual predictions massively. And part of the research suggesting that this change is accelerating is most simply the record average temperatures for months of the year, which not only for a couple of years there was a record was breached, but continuously by record margins. That's right, yeah. So the change is not only in one direction, but it's accelerating. That's right. And on the other hand, the solution that was implemented in the United States for the short term at least, meaning going from coal to gas, is now criticized by some as actually creating more of the climate change issue, of more of the effect on the climate change, because the methane leaks are creating bigger effect than the burning of gas instead of coal is saving. So what do you think is the implications for modeling that, even and discounting?
Exactly. As you have rightly pointed out, we don't even know what the full consequences are. So it's very difficult to model them. Yeah? Donald Rumsfeld's unknowns. Yeah? When you have that, how do you model? Yeah? And also for a complex system like climate, I mean, we don't fully understand this chaotic dynamics. You know? I mean, theories are being developed there, but I mean, it's nowhere near enough, and we'll have to accept that we don't know the full picture. Yeah, and then as you said, some policies that we did ostensibly in the name of coping with climate change might have created even more problems. You know? Or it might create some unexpected side effects, like the U.S. government demanding that some ethanol is mixed with gasoline, created a huge demand for these plants that took place of food crops in some African countries, and added to global hunger and food riot in the early years of 2010s. Yeah? So yes, I mean that basically we need to be constantly re-evaluating the situation. We need to be humble, and I think we basically need to be kind of precautionary. Yeah? Basically, we have to err on the side of assuming the worst, yeah? And then take it from there. Even that worst case scenario might, I mean, following the discussion, following the comments that you have made, even that supposedly worst case scenario may not be the worst, yeah? But at least we want to err on the side of being conservative, and being prepared for the worst, because unlike other things, we have only one planet. Yeah? If you get this wrong, then we are done. Yeah? So I think we basically, while recognizing the complexity and be humble, we try to err on the safe side.
I haven't entirely formulated the question, but essentially it's about neoclassical economics not really having a goal as such, because it tries to navigate, or tries to identify sort of physical or like forces within economic systems, and basically the cost-benefit analysis is just it won't do enough to instigate the change that's needed to mitigate environmental change, because essentially it still places the value on nature in relation to human activity. It doesn't give it intrinsic value. You've touched on that already in this. So my question would be, do you still have hope for cost-benefit analysis if it's developed to the extent that it can sort of, in some way, quantifiably or qualitatively, how do you say it, like value the ecosystems of the Earth? Yeah. Or do you think there's a need for a more fundamental change in economics?
No, at the very kind of general level, I mean, who can argue against the concept of cost-benefit analysis? Yeah? I mean, there's always cost for something, and it always brings some benefit. So at that broad level, I mean, the idea itself is not wrong, but I mean, the contents of it, the market-based way of evaluating things, attempts to put monetary value on things that shouldn't have monetary value, and trying to reduce everything to a single number, and basically accepting the current arrangements of distribution of income, wealth, and power as given, and starting from there, and thereby ending up saying things like, yes, that human life in a poor country costs only 1/15 of human life in a rich country, without realizing what they're really saying. Yeah? So I think that the way it is done is a problem now, but you can put this kind of different contents into it and still do something. However, at some point, the whole thing might kind of disintegrate, because if you begin to really question the underlying social order, then do market prices really have the meaning that you think they have? Yeah? Because in the end, I mean, how cheap human life in Guatemala is not entirely the result of Guatemala having inferior technology. It's also about very unequal distribution of land, very violent governments frequently coming into power, and the kind of rather unpleasant nature of the landlord class there and so on. So, at some point you'll have to admit that these are the real issues rather than the number that we somehow generate through valuing this, valuing that, doing this survey, that survey.